So I am Glenn Tiffert, a distinguished research fellow at the Hoover Institution, where I co-chair our project on China's global sharp power along with Larry Diamond. This is the Hoover Institution's hub for China-focused research. Together with our project on Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific region, chaired by Admiral Jim Ellis, we sponsored the extraordinary volume that is the focus of today's gathering. At a time where the US, its allies, and their vision of a democratic, rules-based international order are being tested on multiple fronts around the world, Matt Pottinger and his co-authors in The Boiling Moat make a powerful case about Xi Jinping's ambitions, the precarity of peace in the Taiwan Strait, and the urgency of stepping up to preserve deterrence there and the freedom of Taiwan's people to choose their own destiny. Most usefully, they lay out reasoned, concrete responses that are scoped to the likely conflict scenarios and are arguably within grasp. The book contains a treasury of action items, not just for the US, but also for Japan, Taiwan, Australia, and Europe. This audience undoubtedly knows our panelists well, but out of respect for them, let me say just a few brief words of introduction about each that will admittedly be grossly insufficient to their accomplished careers and also the multiple ways in which they've given service to our country. We have here Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska, whose advocacy for the US role in what we now term the free and open Indo-Pacific, and whose support for Taiwan goes back decades. We owe our presence in this room to his generosity and to the assistance of his staff. We have a lot of Matts at the Hoover Institution who I am privileged to call colleagues, and two of them just happen to be here with us. Matt Pottinger, former Deputy National Security Advisor to the President and Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Matt Turpin, formerly China Director at the NSC, now a Visiting Fellow at Hoover. And because you came to hear them, not me, let's get right into it. Matt's going to open with some opening brief remarks, then I'll moderate a discussion with the panelists, and we'll open it up to audience Q&A.
Thanks so much, Glenn. And I'm very honored that Senator Sullivan made time today. Senator Sullivan's been one of the leading voices in the country on a smart international policy and national defense, and also specifically on Taiwan. Senator Sullivan's just come back from Taiwan, and I'm eager to hear some of your observations, sir. And Senator Sullivan's been giving us key address for a good while now about the importance of Taiwan and what's at stake, why Taiwan matters, as that one's called, and is called Taiwan really sort of the West Berlin of the new era. And so thank you for your leadership on that. Thanks, Matt Turpin, who has been a thought leader on all things China, even when he was in uniform. It's very unusual for a lieutenant colonel in uniform to be one of the key strategic voices in the U.S. government on a big issue. And I was lucky that he agreed to come work together with me at the National Security Council staff several years ago, and he's gone on to do great things. Glenn, thank you so much and for all that you're working on. Today's actually the 35th anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre. And I think that that's wasn't by design that we're kicking the book off today, but I think it sort of puts into relief what's at stake. When I was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, first living in Beijing, but later in Hong Kong every year on this night, tens of thousands of Hong Kong citizens would gather in Victoria Park to light candles for the victims of the Tiananmen massacre. Many of the people who organized those events that people from all over Hong Kong society would attend are now political prisoners in the People's Republic of China for even talking about these things. Friends of mine, personal friends, Jimmy Lai, Joshua Wong, are political prisoners today, and would urge people to have a thought and prayer for them and the countless others who are prisoners today across the PRC as well. It's really in writing this book, and by the way, I see Mark Montgomery in the back there, who's one of the co-authors. Thanks for coming, Mark. One of the things that we found, my co-authors and I, in doing this research was, one, that this is a deterrable war. We don't have to have this war over Taiwan, that the war that Xi Jinping is in fact preparing in earnest for. But for us to avoid this catastrophe, and this would be an even bigger catastrophe than what we're seeing unfold right now in the Middle East, and certainly even in Ukraine, we have to do certain things urgently that we think we lay out realistic, workable steps in the book for what Taiwan, Japan, Australia, Europe, and the United States need to do in order to close that gap. Really, what it's about is closing the sense of rising optimism in the mind of one man, Xi Jinping, that war is going to work out for him in the end. We need to erode that sense of optimism in a funny way. Because he's a dictator, he's made it easy for us. We only have to convince him. We don't have to convince the entirety of the People's Liberation Army or the rubber stamp National People's Congress or even the Politburo. Xi Jinping is the only decision maker that matters in that system. And so deterrence is really about eroding his, what I fear right now is a rising sense of optimism about what he can achieve. I'll pause there just to come back to you, Glenn, and so that we can have a conversation and open it up.
Excellent. I'd like to start with Senator Sullivan, because you've spoken so cogently over the years about why Taiwan matters. And from where you sit, you're freshly back from the region. Is there anything you'd add to Matt's case for taking urgent steps to defend Taiwan, informed especially by your recent visit to meet with President Lai, but also what you heard from the PRC delegation at the Shangri-La Dialogue?
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Glenn, and to both Matts here for the great work they did during the Trump administration. The great work on the book. It is a bestseller in Taiwan already. No, I'm kidding, but it probably will be. And the great work that they continue to do here with Hoover. So the big takeaway that I had is, I led a bipartisan Senate CODEL to Taiwan just a few days ago, actually, and then we went on to the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, where I think all of you know that's an annual meeting of the defense ministers, foreign ministers, world leaders that gather in Asia. And, our first message was that the United States were an Asia-Pacific power. My state, in many ways, the great state of Alaska, anchors the fact that we're an Asia power. Anchorage is my hometown. It's actually closer to Tokyo than it is to Washington, D.C., right? And if you look at the Aleutian Island chain, that's America. That goes way into Asia. So, the Chinese Communist Party, in particular Xi Jinping, they like to say this, Asia for Asians. We're there. We've been there for hundreds of years, and we're going to be there for hundreds of more years. So that was our first message in both places. Secondly, with regard to Taiwan in particular, as Americans, I think we can all, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, regardless of political party or background, I think every American who goes there and realizes what the history is, you take a lot of pride. Matt mentioned that I've kind of used the analogy that Taiwan is in many ways the 21st century West Berlin. Well, you look at America's history with regard to West Berlin and what we did over decades, a huge, aggressive, authoritarian power wanting to swallow that outpost of liberty up, and we prevented that in 1948, throughout the 50s, throughout the 60s, and in the same way, American commitment has essentially kept Taiwan free for decades. My first deployment as a U.S. Marine was to the Taiwan Strait during the third Taiwan Strait crisis. That was just one of many examples in our history. And so we were there as a bipartisan group of senators. There was a bipartisan group of House members to be there to congratulate the president. 8th presidential election, by the way, the freest, one of the freest places in the world. And I always like to make the point, of course, China, Xi, the CCP, the PLA, they are a threat to Taiwan. There's no doubt about it. But Taiwan also is a threat to them. And I think most of us know the reason why. It is a direct challenge to the model of Communist Party governance on the mainland. It is a direct challenge to the notion that one person ruling in perpetuity, crushing all dissent, knows what's best for 1.4 billion people. And I think that Xi Jinping gets really nervous, just like Putin, because one of their greatest weaknesses is that they fear their own people. And they know that there's millions of Chinese looking across the Taiwan Strait at Taiwan with their 8th presidential election saying, hey, how come we can't do that? That scares them. That scares them. So we were there to congratulate them, to show our support. And one big takeaway that we met with everybody, president, vice president, all the national security, foreign policy ministers, importantly, different leaders of the legislature, the speaker, different party leaders. And you're reading about some of the politics that are going on. That happens in any democracy right now between the president and the legislature. But I think there is a very strong commitment among all parties, among the executive branch, among the legislative branch, to continue to increase defense spending and increase their capability with regard to their military capabilities. So that was a message we wanted to deliver. We thanked them or showed our appreciation in public at 2 different press events on their recent changes in their conscription law that took their conscription time from 4 months to a year. Everybody thought that was going to be really difficult politically. It took a lot of courage. And then what have we seen in the polling? The Taiwanese people are hugely supportive of that change. Shows you what leadership can do. When people think that's going to be hard, they know they need that. So these are some of the messages we brought, Glenn, and it was, I think, a constructive and important visit.
So Matt, there's been a lot that's been written about the challenges that Taiwan faces largely because of the PRC. How is your book different?
So, look, some of the things that conclusions we arrived at. Number one is that we and Taiwan and other friends need to be preparing for a full-blown invasion. It's not because China might not try something short of an invasion. They're already using gray zone, so-called gray zone activities, political warfare, psychological warfare, showing their military sort of surrounding Taiwan. But the odds of Beijing attempting something else military, like a offshore island capture or attempting a sustained blockade, those things become far less likely if Beijing is persuaded that they wouldn't be able to escalate further, if it's sort of increasingly obvious that they would not succeed at a full-blown invasion. So debates that are going on in Taiwan about whether Taiwan should actually be buying equipment to match Chinese Coast Guard vessels ship for ship or destroyers ship for ship, no. Taiwan needs to be focused on demonstrating that it has the will and capability to repel an invasion with help from nearby friends. And that is actually going to make those other scenarios less likely and less dangerous and less psychologically potent. So that is one of the ideas that we arrived at. Others are that, look, geography is Taiwan's friend. People often think, my gosh, look, it's so far from America, it's so close to Beijing. But what would the Ukrainians have given to have a 100-mile ocean between them and Russia? They would have given anything for that. Senator Sullivan, who's also a Marine, was just commenting a minute ago before we came up on just how foreboding Taiwan is as a target for an amphibious invasion, and all of that is true. So the key feature is that moat that we refer to, the boiling moat. Jincheng Tangshi is the Chinese name for the book because it refers to a Han Dynasty statesman who said, don't attack strongpoint cities that are surrounded by metal ramparts and boiling moats. Beijing cannot succeed in subjugating Taiwan if it can't get its Navy and its soldiers across that moat, which should be turned into a boiling moat and can be turned into a boiling moat at much lower cost for the defenders than the cost that Beijing's investing to build hundreds and hundreds of warships and ferries and so forth. Those are a couple points that I wanted to call out.
Let me turn to you, Matt Turpin, for a moment, because we frequently hear commentators talk about the risk of an accidental war precipitated by a collision at sea or one in the air, or the visit by some politician to some place that they're not supposed to go to in the eyes of someone. How real is this risk? One of the great, I think, statements in this book is you take up the question of accidental war. So walk us through that.
Yeah, I think there's sort of much made of this idea that we could mistakenly or accidentally find ourselves in a conflict, that an accident happens and suddenly we find ourselves in this sort of escalation cycle in which we're then in a general war. And I think, first of all, we should be very clear with ourselves that's just not how wars start. Wars are the most intentional human activity that is ever conducted. People don't just wake up one morning and accidentally find themselves in a war, right? They start wars when they think they are going to win. They start wars when they think that they can achieve the outcome that they want to achieve at a cost that is lower than the benefits they think they're going to gain from doing so. And so when we go back to this sort of idea that Matt sort of laid out and mentioned earlier, this is a deterrable war, right? Xi Jinping can be convinced that the cost of this far exceeds the benefit that he would gain. Now, of course, from Beijing's perspective, they want to make sure that we all understand, or we believe, that in fact that accidental war could happen, right? That our provocations could cause the war to erupt. And I think we should be very clear that that is, of course, their strategy to deter us, but we shouldn't necessarily be deterred from that approach.
And I would add, this is such a counterintuitive point. It was counterintuitive for me when I was exploring this question of accidental wars, because we've all been taught, we've read The Guns of August. We've always believed that World War I was just this terrible accident. In fact, the consequences were quite accidental and horrific, but the war was incredibly intentional by those who made the decision to go to war. And I challenge friends in the press not to repeat this claim because it's ahistorical, this idea of an unintentional war could break out. I refer you to three historians. There are many others, but three who really did serious work on this. Geoffrey Blaney of Australia, Evan Lourd, who was a socialist member of parliament first in the Labour Party and then in a splinter party in the UK, but who was also a very accomplished scholar. Evan Lourd studied hundreds of years of war, as did Geoffrey Blaney, as did the Oxford and Yale historian Michael Howard. All of them said, if there is such a thing as an accidental war, none of us could find one. And so the problem with buying into this idea of escalatory spirals that just happen because of a little accident. Accidents do happen at sea, but they don't lead to war unless one party was already intending to go to war and they want to use that as a pretext. But pretexts for war should not be confused with causes for war. So even when accidents happen, like an EP-3 American spy plane gets knocked out of the sky accidentally by a Chinese pilot who dies in the process, or an American pilot of a B-2 bomber mistakenly targets a Chinese embassy in Serbia, as happened back 25 years ago, neither of those events led to war, nor would they lead to war today. They might become a pretext if Beijing was already intent on fighting. So if we're armed with that knowledge, we start to behave a little bit differently. We stop shrinking away because we're afraid of provoking a crisis. And paradoxically, the tougher we are and the more resolute we are in dealing with military threats, the paradox is the more stable the situation is likely to become. So a little bit of tactical friction can lead to strategic stability. So I'd commend Matt Turpin's chapter with me on this subject, chapter 3.
So a lot of what the U.S. needs to do in order to deter China has to really start at home, expanding our defense industrial base, clearing the logjams in foreign military sales, rebalancing our military capabilities, and procurement. I want to invite Senator Sullivan to talk about how the Congress is tackling those challenges in order to stand with Taiwan, and for the Mats also to kick in with some of the recommendations from the book as well.
Well, again, let me, this is a handout. Matt mentioned it. I think we provided it to many of you, a speech that I've given quite a lot. But if you have it, I'd invite everybody to turn to page 18. And there's a chart, and it shows 3 layers of deterrence. Now, I'm not going to claim that I came up with this idea. A great Marine who we all admire, Joe Dunford, actually, many years ago mentioned this to me. But that's a concept right there on how to think about deterrence. Because what we need, what Matt's book focuses on, is deterrence with regard to, and he actually articulated it perfectly, with regard to one man, which makes it challenging, but also makes it maybe not so challenging. And when you look at the 3 layers that I think are important, the first is Taiwan's own defense capability, the ability to fight and to be trained. And I think that that layer of deterrence, in my view, is clearly increasing in a positive way. One recent way in which that has been, will be increasing is the National Security Supplemental that the Congress just recently passed. The original supplemental that came over from the White House did not have a lot with regard to Indo-Pacific and Taiwan, weapon systems in particular. Myself and a couple other senators, we worked hard to make sure that that National Security Supplemental dramatically plussed up Taiwan's capabilities. So that's one layer. The second layer is essentially our response capability. That is the layer in many ways that has kept Taiwan free for decades. You look at all the different crises that have occurred with regard to the PLA in Taiwan, and usually they have been, they've ended because the United States military has shown up and essentially said, hey, not today. And I believe, unfortunately, that that layer is going in the wrong direction. Right now, we are shrinking, not we, but the Biden administration's budget currently shrinks the Army, shrinks the Navy, shrinks the Marine Corps. Our ability to produce Navy ships is dramatically declining. And a number of us Democrats and Republicans are raising the alarm bell on what a crisis that is becoming. By the end of this decade, we will have estimates about 140 to 150 Navy ships less than the PLA does. 140, 150. We have better ships in the Navy, but at a certain point, quantity becomes its own quality. And that is going in the wrong direction. The third layer, which never gets talked about, and I think has, in many ways, the most potential for real strength with regard to deterrence, is devastating economic, financial, energy sanctions that would be triggered by an invasion of the PLA of Taiwan. I have legislation called the Stand with Taiwan Act that does just that. Former Congressman Mike Gallagher was the lead in the House. The good news was I'd been working hard on Senator Tammy Duckworth, Democrat from Illinois, to join me on that legislation in our meeting with the president of Taiwan. She announced that she was joining me, which was a big development. So that is something that the Congress can do, and I think could have very significant deterrent capabilities. Now, all of this needs to be overlaid into one element of Matt's book that I think is exceptional, and that is a lot of focus on our allies. So often, the challenge in the Taiwan Strait has been focused on the United States, the PLA, and Taiwan. And one of the great insights of this book is saying, hey, no longer. We need to bring our allies into this deterrence matrix So whether it's in the second layer of deterrence with an American response capability militarily with our allies, and we certainly would want them to be there with us, or perhaps even more importantly, and I've been going around the world, literally to our allies with my Stand with Taiwan legislation saying, Germany, EU, UK, Japan, Australia, Korea, you need your own version of this legislation. Think about that deterrence. If you had 70% of the world's GDP saying, hey, an invasion of Taiwan will trigger massive economic sanctions from all of our countries, just the Australians, if they, as noted again in your book, said we're going to put major sanctions on on iron ore and LNG, that is deterrence. So our allies being part of these three layers, which is again a big insight into Matt's book, I think is a really important component of deterrence. And in that regard, I think we are heading in the right direction.
I promise I'll come to the allies question in just a minute, but let's stick with the United States here. What can we do strategically in terms of procurement, in terms of raising consciousness that you call for in the book?
We argue in the book that we already have the technologies that we need to effectively deter or defeat the PLA in a conflict over Taiwan. The problem is we don't have munitions in sufficient quantity, and we're not training enough with our allies, with Japan, as well as with Taiwan in particular, to show that we feel pretty comfortable with the various approaches that we could take. We want our commanders to have options for how to fight this war. We don't want them to have to rely on one exquisite, perfect clockwork war plan. We should have multiple ways of fighting this and winning it, and Beijing should have to prepare for a variety of different ways of having to contend with an allied force. Right now, some of the capabilities that we think have been overlooked that already exist are heavy bombers. Remember, our submarines are an incredibly important asymmetric advantage we enjoy. But we don't have enough of them, and they have to travel a long way to reload with new torpedoes before they can be back in the fight. To make a decisive difference. So heavy bombers can make the flight all the way from the United States in a matter of hours, launch anti-ship missiles from a standoff distance. They don't even have to fly over Taiwan. And then they can go back, reload, and come back again. You can have an aerial highway of anti-ship missiles getting dumped down into the boiling moat. Long-range anti-ship missiles are a very potent weapon that the U.S. Air Force doesn't really buy many of. They sort of leave it to the U.S. Navy. The Navy doesn't have the heavy bombers. There are also even cheaper weapons called powered JDAMs or PJDAMs. It's just a laser-guided bomb or one of our standard bombs, but with wings and a rocket and a different targeting kit that can also be very dangerous. Our point is not that we need to just go with any one single capability, but actually a range of capabilities, including capabilities that Taiwan can be fielding with help from the United States, pre-positioning capabilities on Taiwan involving anti-ship missiles, drones, and similar sort of, in some cases, AI powered capabilities that would inject serious friction into war planning. So we've got to actually revamp our industrial base, right? We fought these counterinsurgency wars for a couple of decades, and we throttled back our manufacture of munitions to the bare minimum. We need longer-term contracts so that industry invests. I think over time we need to move away from guaranteed profits, this so-called cost-plus model, to something that just says, look, here's the contract. You can have as much profit as you want so long as you meet deadlines and give us the weapons that we need. That's what encourages innovation and efficiency, which is one of our advantages that we have over the PRC.
I think I would say at the most basic level, for decade now, we have essentially stagnated our defense spending. We're spending about 2.3% of GDP on defense. That is about what we were spending back in 2013 as we started sequestration. And that was a far more benign international environment. We now face two regional ongoing conflicts that we have significant commitments to, and we are essentially facing a far more capable PLA that is expanding its modernization and capabilities, and we are finding ourselves spread really incredibly thin. Without significant increases in what those spending are, I am afraid that Xi Jinping concludes that he has an opportunity to be able to use force to achieve something that he's been unable to do through peaceful means. And that's what has me sort of most concerned. I think, for a quick transition to some of the allies, I think we should congratulate our Japanese friends at the hard effort they've made to make serious investments in their own defense and the ways in which they are ramping themselves up to be able to do this. And I think that's an incredibly important step that they're taking. And I think we've got to be able to help match that with our own increases in abilities to be able to provide for these things. Again, our effort here is to affect the perception of an adversary. Xi Jinping needs to conclude that things are not going his way in this competition. My fear is that right now he does not have good reason to believe that the United States is preparing for how he would fight this.
Thanks for that transition, Matt. You and I have both spent a lot of time in Europe having conversations around this set of issues. And so I'd actually invite you to pivot towards the European piece of this, of which there's a chapter dedicated to that by former NATO Secretary General Rasmussen. And to talk about this in the context first of capabilities, but also the book convincingly raises the concept of social depth. And that is, in order to have deterrence, it isn't just about military hardware, it's about consciousness, it's about will to fight, it's about mobilizing your population to have their hearts in deterrence. And after you do that, I invite you to do the same, Matt, with regard to the Japan, the Australia pieces as well. And then let's talk about social depth in the United States. So much of maintaining deterrence will ensure that the American people understand what the stakes are here and that they will be in it long enough to sustain a credible deterrence, because a lot will be asked of them. And let's hope it's never blood and treasure and the blood piece. But beginning with you, Matt, and then working down the table.
Sure. So I think Senator Sullivan had kind of laid this out first. So following the sanctions regime that was put in place after Putin's illegal war on Ukraine, we have now created the floor of what the expectation would be of the international response, right? So from Beijing's perspective, it is already baked in that we would likely do as much, at least as much in the economic and sanctions realm around Taiwan as we would do, as we have already done on Ukraine. And until we are able to get really a consensus across our European allies and others to do that as at least the base minimum, again, very difficult to persuade Beijing that they are not going to be successful. So we need to persuade them that at least the minimum is in place. And then obviously, as we think about their contributions and their preparing of sort of their own internal will to fight, again, we face multiple aligned adversaries simultaneously, right? I mean, this is the sort of the worst case scenario. When I left the Pentagon in 2017, the idea that Beijing and Moscow, Pyongyang and Tehran would be teamed up together and essentially fighting and supporting each other in multiple ongoing conflicts was really one of those things that was a dream scenario. It was one of those sort of nightmarish scenarios that no one thought was possible. Well, it is possible. It is happening today. Pyongyang is providing ballistic missiles to Russia, hitting Ukrainian cities, right? We're seeing the same thing, the same kind of provision of response from the Iranians. We're watching the Chinese provide massive military support to keep the Russian industrial base going. And we've watched Russia make claims that they would also help and provide strategic depth to Beijing and their plans. And so we are now in a much more dangerous environment. And so, we've been advocating our NATO allies for 2% of GDP, but again, that was back in 2007 when we dealt with a far more benign international environment, and we still have not met that from all those partners. And so those things have to be met, and we need folks to step up to those levels and beyond to be able to get to the kind of deterrence that we need to have, or we will find ourselves in the conflict we didn't want to be in.
Over to you, Matt, for Japan and Taiwan.
The commander of the Japanese fleet, Admiral Yoji Koda, who's recently retired, wrote one of the chapters of the book about Japan's role. And it's a terrific chapter. It's a brave chapter because it's very frank. It lays out the reality that I think a lot of Japanese leaders know quietly, but don't always speak publicly about, which is that there's no way that Japan avoids getting sucked into a conflict over Taiwan, and not just as a piece of real estate that Americans use, but they're going to be pulled into this thing and actually have the ability to play a decisive role in favor of both deterrence or victory in the event of a war. So Japan, in a sense, is a swing state. Former Colonel Grant Newsham wrote on this topic in the book as well, both very, very serious chapters. But what Japan needs to start doing, in our view, is to start speaking even more publicly with its citizenry. Its citizenry has come a very long way, really in large thanks to Xi Jinping himself. He's been so bellicose, so full frontal, that Japanese people understand the nature of the threat now. What they haven't yet been asked to do is to start preparing for a mobilization. What would a mobilization look like? It means that a lot of Japan's civilian hospitals are going to have to be working to save the lives of Japanese, American, and perhaps even some Taiwanese soldiers and civilians in the event of a war. It means that 100 or more Japanese civilian airfields will have to be put to military use. It really means that you need to start doing rehearsals and then dress rehearsals for what is to come, because these wars are really come down to logistics. And the more that Japan demonstrates its willingness and ability to rehearse, the less likely it is that we would have to fight this. We saw a very bellicose comment this week. I believe it was from China's ambassador to Japan, sort of scolding Japan, saying, "Don't you dare get involved, in the event that we have to go kill Taiwanese civilians." That's a very good sign in the sense that China, it shows you that China knows this is a serious vulnerability for them. If Japan is in this, it becomes a whole lot of a tougher, much greater fight that China will have on its hands.
And of course, Taiwan.
Taiwan, I just saw that Mike Hunziker, one of my co-authors, came in. It wrote a terrific, very blunt chapter 4 of the book, which is about Taiwan's military culture and a lot of the things that need to change quickly. I led together with Mark Montgomery and some others at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a bunch of Israeli retired generals and an Israeli former national security advisor to Taiwan last summer, where we had very frank exchanges with Taiwan about how Taiwan should be thinking about organizing its personnel. Because, people talk about weapon systems and this and that. It's really about the people, how you train, how you organize to fight. And Israel has won every war that it's ever been involved in, God willing, and I'm confident that they'll bring the current fight to victory, a victorious ending for Israel as well. But Israel has a very small, actually, military, surprisingly small. It relies heavily on a reserve force. That reserve force is smaller than people think as well, but it's extremely well trained. Taiwan has a massive reserve force that is very poorly trained. And so this is really about reorganizing the way that you fight. Mike Hunziker, I refer you to his chapter on this, looking also at some of the things that other ministries in Taiwan should be doing so that the Ministry of National Defense in Taiwan doesn't have to be thinking about sort of the territorial defense inland, but also because the Ministry of National Defense needs a little bit of a competition within the Taiwan bureaucracy in order to keep them from becoming overly complacent.
Senator Sullivan, there are a lot of conversations like this here within the Beltway, but have we done enough to take these conversations out to Main Street in the United States, and what could we be doing better?
No, we haven't, and I think it's a big challenge, right? Matt was just talking about will. I for the Taiwanese, I had a very interesting meeting with President Tsai last year, and we talked about will. And, the big issue from the U.S. perspective is, are we seeing, if there is, God forbid, a cross-strait conflict, is the will of the Taiwanese more like what we're seeing in Ukraine or more like what we saw in Afghanistan? And I have said this, pretty bluntly, if the United States is involved with the potential of American service members' sacrifice and lives on the line, we can't want this more than they want it, right? The will has to be paramount with the Taiwanese. And so that's a question that, of course, you never know the answer to until the moment that bullets start flying. President Tsai, though, did have I thought, very simple but insightful response when I asked that question, and I asked that question a lot over the last few days when I was in Taiwan, and of their current leadership. Her focus was that will is a function of many components, but well-equipped and well-trained military forces gives a society a certain amount of will. And I think that that's a really important element that, again, when you look at the Taiwan Relations Act, which is what continues to drive our policy with regard to Taiwan, one of the things that we have committed to as a government, as a Congress, is to help Taiwan be able to defend itself with weapons and other elements. That's in our law. That's what drives our policy today. Glenn, to your broader question of the United States, I don't think, particularly on this topic, that our leadership has done enough. It's one of the reasons I've put together this pamphlet, this speech, just to talk about it. It is a source when you talk to Americans and you walk them through the history. It is a source of pride, as I mentioned in my kind of opening remarks, that our commitment, yes, our sacrifice, has done a lot, has been decisive in keeping this island democracy free, dynamic. It's one of the most dynamic economies in the world. It's one of the freest places in the world. So, but we need to do more. And again, our will also relates to what Matt had said earlier. My own strong view is that we are going in the wrong direction as it relates to our readiness for our own military forces, our defense spending. Again, we're on the path of being below 3% of GDP. That's not a place where America typically has been in the last 80 years. And when you have that lack of readiness in our own country, that could impact will for the United States as well. So we need to turn that around in a whole host of ways. Matt already talked about the defense industrial base. We're getting a start on that. The supplemental that we just passed, 60% of that bill, 60% goes to building weapons and reconstituting our own atrophied defense industrial base. So that's a good start. But we have a long way to go. And we're in a real dangerous time. The dictators are all working together. They're on the march. They have no hesitation to invade their neighbors. And we need to wake up to that.
China is not shy about displaying its growing might, and there are those who say that we should dial down the high-level visits, we should dial down the freedom of navigation operations, we should dial down the rhetoric in order not to provoke them, not to annoy them, to manage the relationship. What is the argument of your book with regard to those who say those things?
Those who argue that showing resolve in effect is provocative, I think are proven wrong by history, right? Again, it's that paradox we were talking about earlier. The more resolve you show, the more stabilizing effects you tend to have on a dictator. Dictatorships, Leninist dictatorships, China has a saying, it's 欺人怕硬. So dictators like to bully people until they encounter strength or something firm, and so that it is that firmness that we are shrinking from our responsibility to be firmer, more willing to accept friction in the relationship with China, more willing to be, frankly, confrontational, and yet those are the ingredients to resolve. And the things that are more likely to get dictators like the ones in Beijing or in Tehran or in Moscow or even in Caracas and in Pyongyang to think twice or three times, as the Chinese saying goes, before marching again. So that's in a nutshell our answer.
Yeah, and I'd only add that Beijing likes to present the idea that whether it's the United States preparing itself, or the Taiwanese preparing themselves, or the Japanese preparing themselves, that will somehow force them or provoke them into a conflict. Of course, what they're saying is to persuade us not to pursue those efforts, right? Because those are the things that they find most problematic and stand as obstacles in the way of achieving their goals, right? So I think we should be sort of less sensitive to the rhetoric that they use, and more confident in the idea that if we are prepared and Beijing concludes that it's not a good idea to use military force, or they may not succeed, that is in fact the right approach to take on these things. And I think for me at least, fundamentally, this requires us to sort of take ourselves out of a cooperative relationship as we had from sort of the 1980s, through to about a decade ago, where we presumed that we were partners and we could just through negotiation find some way to overcome these differences, and really recognize that we are rivals, and that we are rivals that are locked in what I think is very clearly a new Cold War. And therefore, we need to treat the relationship that way and seek to deter conflict rather than pretend like we're in an old relationship where we're far more likely to make the other side conclude that they can use military force to invade their neighbor, right? My one comparison to where we were in February of 2022, Vladimir Putin didn't invade Ukraine because he thought NATO was strong. He invaded Ukraine because he thought NATO was weak and wouldn't respond. And that's, I think, the dilemma that we find ourselves in, is that we must not allow these types of regimes to conclude that they have an opportunity to use force.
And I'll just add to the question, Glenn, because I think we have some fairly recent examples of how the approach that you mentioned that some are calling for has backfired. When I got to the Senate in 2015, some of you might remember President Xi visited the White House in a meeting with President Obama in the Rose Garden, publicly declared that they were not going to be pursuing the militarization of the South China Sea. So that's one leader of a large country, China, standing next to the leader of the President of the United States in the Rose Garden saying, we're not going to do that, okay? That was not true. That was a lie. They did it, okay? So that was what a lot of us refer to as promise fatigue with the Chinese. I've been in countless meetings in previous jobs where you see Chinese leadership make commitments that they don't keep. Intellectual property rights, cyber theft, it is a long list. Promise fatigue. But this is what the President of the United States on a really big issue. Now, there was a number of folks in the Biden administration that were trying to placate the Chinese, John Kerry being, the number one in my view, who was Secretary of State at the time. And there was this big push not to do freedom of navigation operations during this time. I was a brand new senator here, and we would, on the Armed Services Committee, pound the leadership of the Pentagon saying you need to do freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea to prevent this buildup. You need to do it. Secretary of the Navy, you need to do it. CNO of the Navy, you need to do it. Indo-Pacific Commander, you need to do it. Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, you need to do it. They resisted, they resisted, they resisted. Later, it was been reported that Secretary Kerry in principals meetings was saying, hey, we can't do FONOPs because we'll antagonize the Chinese and they won't sign the Paris Climate Accords. Okay, go look that up. You can't make that stuff up. That is exuding weakness, and we didn't gain anything from that hesitation to do freedom of navigation operations, which, by the way, we have been doing since the beginning of the Republic. So a huge lost period of time that we gained nothing. They gained everything because we had very weak leaders in the Obama administration, in my view, especially the Secretary of State. So we learned a lesson. And I think certainly the Trump administration, but I will also give credit to the Biden administration. They are doing regular FONOPs all over the world, including in the Taiwan Strait. They have encouraged some of our allies to do FONOPs in the Taiwan Strait, which they're doing. That's what we need to do. So we have a very real example 10 years ago of where our own country said, we're not going to do that. We're going to antagonize these guys. They might not join the Paris Climate Accords. By the way, Xi Jinping promised us in the Rose Garden he wasn't going to militarize the South China Sea anyways. Total, complete policy failure. We should never do that again.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. I think the discussion period comes to a close now. We'll open it up to audience Q&A, and I appreciate you joining us today.
I think I got to go vote. We're a democracy. We vote. So thank you again to the Matts, Glenn, to this great turnout, by the way. Congratulations on the book. This is a real important component of what we need to do. And then look, it's a great turnout here. So you got a lot of smart, interested people. So really appreciate the contribution, guys. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, everyone.
I would just say, look, the former NATO Secretary General actually contributed a chapter to this book, and his successor has been just as strong. Jens Stoltenberg at NATO, they talk a lot about China now. I think NATO leadership in particular has shown real leadership on this. I think the UK has been very good. It's one of the reasons that I commend the Biden administration for the AUKUS agreement, which brings a European power, the United Kingdom, into really this problem set, together with Australia and the United States. We do see, though, to your point, we see some European leaders occasionally make unwise remarks about how this isn't really Europe's problem. It's someone else's problem. But I've also seen a lot of blowback for leaders who have made comments like that from their contemporaries. It's really the flip side of the question of, is Ukraine an American problem? You're damn right it is, right? And Taiwan, it would be an even bigger problem for Europe if it ends up in a war. The effects on Europe's economy will be quite dramatic. We're talking about a depression, probably, in all probability, pretty quickly in the event of a Taiwan war. So, yeah, Ukraine is part of our problem, or the Russians are, and the People's Republic of China and its aggressive dictator are Europe's problem too. But you're right, we have to keep making that argument publicly.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is, of course, our friends in Europe have sort of two separate systems in which they think about these challenges. There is a there's a defense system that's organized around NATO, and then from the economic trade and sort of other sort of national level activities, I mean, we're really talking about individual member states and the European Union, and they've had a challenge on figuring out how to coordinate those two things. But I think we have actually seen, really starting as far back as 5 years ago, but accelerating an increasing awareness in European capitals as well as in Brussels that a conflict in the Taiwan Strait would be massively impactful on them and would cause them massive problems, right? And I think so. There's an understanding of the scope of what it is. They have yet to fully come to a sense of consensus about what they should be doing in a holistic way. And fundamentally, it would have to be executed through both NATO and the EU for them to be able to do this. And that has not fully happened all the way. But I think there actually has been progress, and I commend the Biden administration for really hard work on this. I think they've done a fairly good job of bringing this along. It does require more work. It's going to require more investment of time and energy.
I would add that actually Vladimir Putin has gone a long way towards making the case easier to convince European foreign policy elites that this is something they need to take seriously. The conversation has changed dramatically since the war in Ukraine.
Yeah. So look, some of the political warfare that Beijing is pursuing right now against Taiwan, legal warfare, public opinion warfare, psychological warfare. That's really the name of the game with the military maneuvers, the sort of encroaching around Jinmen, and some of the other offshore islands. Ivan Kanapathy, a colleague of Matt Turpin's and mine when we were at the National Security Council staff, writes maybe a controversial chapter in the book about how we need to keep some of these gray zone activities in perspective because they are mainly designed to achieve psychological effect. And they are a long way from actually imposing Beijing's will over Taiwan. So he sort of counsels perspective and even a bit of patience on a lot of those activities. Ultimately, if Beijing decides that it wants to, attack an offshore island, whether it's Jinmen or Wuqiu Island or one of the others, it's not going to gain a whole lot strategically, but it will have alerted the world in ways that the world should respond to by imposing massive costs on Beijing. Sanctions, probably we should be sending U.S. troops to Taiwan at that point to prepare for a potential war. Beijing doesn't really gain a whole lot from that strategy. The only way that strategy works out well for Beijing is if it turns out to have been the calling of a bluff on our part. If Beijing takes territory by force and we just have pinprick piecemeal sort of responses, sort of weak tea sanctions on obscure Chinese companies, that will invite further aggression. So I think we need to be prepared for something like that if Xi Jinping decides to do that. But that's where we impose asymmetrically steep costs in order to forestall an even worse crisis. It's very interesting that Beijing now is calling out as a grave threat the long-standing alliances that have been in place in the Western Pacific for decades. I think that's a big clue for us about what Beijing's ambitions are, because when China was much, much, much weaker and poorer, it made much less of a big deal about all of these alliances that at the time were actually an even greater threat just by virtue of the imbalance in favor of democratic power in the region. So what it really speaks to is the fact that Beijing's goal is not to defensively push back against this sense of envelopment, even though it likes to present it that way. This is really about a much, much grander set of ambitions. And if we listen to Xi Jinping's own words, if we look at the name of his recent strategy that he unveiled last fall, it's the Global Civilization Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Defense Initiative. I mean, we start to get the hint at some point that he's got global ambitions. This isn't about feeling a little bit hemmed in at home when actually we've been there all along. This is about recreating the nature of global governance to make it safe for autocracy, and I dare say totalitarian autocracy.
I think there's some lessons that we would have hoped Xi Jinping had learned, but I think it's pretty clear that he has not learned these lessons. And so one of them would be respect for sovereignty and the peaceful resolution of disputes. I suspect that Xi Jinping has not learned the lesson that that's the path to pursue, that in fact you can pursue seizing other territory, and you could probably survive it, right? So I think he probably has learned that lesson, which is not what we would wanted to have him to have learned. I think we also would say that he has probably learned the lesson that the sanctions the United States and its allies can put together are not sufficient to be able to undermine a country that does use force to wage a war of aggression, right? So I think that's, and I suspect that Xi Jinping has, we would have hoped that he would have learned that his friendship without limits with Vladimir Putin was a problem for him. I suspect that he has learned that his friendship without limits with Vladimir Putin is an incredible benefit to him, right? So my fear is that there may be lessons that we think that he should have rationally learned from this, but I suspect that he looks at it in a different light, and is likely learning that Moscow's problem in February of 2022 was not waging a war; it was in the execution of how they did it. It wasn't done quickly enough. It wasn't done violently enough. It didn't decapitate the leadership fast enough. Right? Those are likely the lessons that he learned from this, not don't use force. So I'm very concerned at the direction that we find ourselves going.
Yeah. A question from Ambassador Curry just about the Philippine situation. Why is Beijing, it's no coincidence that after Hamas did its worst in southern Israel on October the 7th of last year, that Beijing almost immediately began putting intense pressure on the Philippines over a little atoll that is almost within a direct view, a line of sight of the coast of the Philippines. This is about testing. It's about trying to create a sense of futility by among the Philippine people, trying to drive a wedge between the Philippines and the United States, or expose the U.S. as feckless. This is about trying to spread us even thinner. And I fear that we've got more of this to come, either in the form of an intensification of the existing wars in multiple theaters now, or the addition of new theaters of conflict. The Venezuelan dictator has said that he may annex by force his neighbor Guyana. China has provided some sympathetic propaganda in support of his position. The Russians are mucking around in Venezuela. The Quds force from Iran is all over Venezuela, and now Bolivia as well. So we're watching this thing metastasize, this new axis of chaos. And chaos is the word, not my word, that's Xi Jinping's word. He's given multiple addresses where he's talked about how chaos is one of the primary features of the globe today, and that China has to find ways to make that chaos work to Beijing's advantage. So the axis of chaos is metastasizing, and we have not held the red lines that we have drawn. The most important red line that President Biden drew was in a direct video call to Xi Jinping in March. It might have been late February. No, it was March of 2022, right after Putin invaded, did the full-blown invasion. And President Biden, according to his own public account of the call, he said, I told Xi Jinping that if you provide material support to Russia, you may, in effect, lose access to the U.S. and European markets. And you need our markets more than you need the Russian market. Some of his cabinet officers made threats to back up President Biden. 2 years later, we now see that Beijing has flagrantly crossed that red line. They are, according to our Secretary of State, the overwhelming #1 supporter of the war machine in Russia that's waging war on European cities. Secretary Blinken also said that China has changed the course of the war in the sense that if not for Chinese support for Russia, it's unlikely that Russia would have been able to have sustained the war effort this long. So if that's not violating the red line, I just don't know what is, yet we still have not imposed costs, even though we've promised them. That invites a new round of intensification and spread of war. Get ready for it. According to the last decade, every time the United States has failed to sustain a red line, it's usually almost exactly 6 months later that a new war starts. After we were overrun by the Taliban, 6 months later, Vladimir Putin marched towards Kiev. Back in 2013, when President Obama failed to enforce his red line to punish Bashar al-Assad for using chemical weapons on his own people, it was exactly 6 months later that Vladimir Putin invaded Crimea and started the decade-long Ukraine war. So we are now in the window, the failure to enforce that history tells us is inviting new rounds of aggression by the axis of chaos. Get ready for it.
The one thing I'd add is just this weekend. So I flew back from the Shangri-La dialogue yesterday. As Senator Sullivan had been there, and during the dialogue, President Zelensky was in Singapore, asking ASEAN countries and other countries throughout Asia to participate in the World Peace Summit that'll be held in Geneva in a few weeks. And he revealed by the end of Sunday evening that the Chinese were actively undermining and discouraging and coercing countries not to participate on behalf of their Russian partners, right? So I think we need to recognize that we are watching this axis of chaos build itself together and knit itself together. And we should then say to ourselves, is our defense sufficient for that problem, right? Because again, our planning had been around, we're only dealing with regional conflicts, not something that is much more globalized. And then are we actually preparing ourselves for this sort of new regime that we are in? And I don't think that we are, and we're going to need to do significantly more. I don't think we should fool ourselves into believing that the threat of economic sanctions or the threat of economic retaliation is going to be sufficient to deter. I think that's, it'll be additive. These are now sort of the basic requirements of what we would have to be able to do is to be able to enforce those kinds of economic punishments. But they're already baked in, right? Beijing has already baked in the kinds of things that we might do from an economic sanctions perspective. And they have now, obviously with the example in Ukraine, they've had 2 years to prepare countermeasures and to shore up their own positions in these things. And so, we should, if the idea of sort of integrated deterrence is that you're going to have a shortfall in hard power and you're going to make up for that with sort of economic sanctions and cooperation with allies, I don't think that our adversaries necessarily think that is sufficiently deterrent. And they will act in ways that, so if we solely rely upon it, I think we're in a real challenge. I think fundamentally we are moving to being sort of, we are watching the diversification by both Beijing and Washington to both try and diversify our economies away from each other while making each other more reliant on the other, right? So the United States wants to make Beijing more reliant on us and exploit vulnerabilities of them, but they're doing the mirror opposite. And so that means it's going to be really difficult to maintain that over time. I think what we're going to see is a new economic system emerge as both Washington and Beijing seek to pursue its own courses. Now, I'm fairly confident that, we have an example of what industrial policy with Chinese characteristic looks like, and that is a highly state-centralized control over corporate entities, right, and a party-driven sort of apparatus. The United States is going to develop its own industrial policy with American characteristics, and it isn't going to look like that. Now, we're going to have fears about that would look like, but we'll make it work on our own, in our own sort of style, in our own way. And I'm actually fairly confident that we'll be able to figure that out. We just have to commit to it and start to do it.
I'm going to kick in one thing, and it's a simple math problem. I think it's a mistake to think about this in purely bilateral terms. We have to solve for only one supply chain risk. That's China. China has to solve for a supply chain risk of a global coalition of countries that have technologies and markets that it needs. That's a much more complex problem for it. We have a world that is hungry to climb the value chain, that would love the opportunity to build the things that China is now building. And we simply have to sort of use that leverage and that opportunity.
Yeah. So look, blockade is a very tricky scenario. On the one hand, Taiwan depends on imports for most of its energy needs, a significant amount of its food needs. Its economy thrives on its export of all the incredible things they make there, like high-end semiconductors and electronics. So in that sense, it's quite vulnerable to a blockade. On the other hand, blockades are very hard to enforce. And our view is that it's less likely that Beijing would undertake a sustained blockade if it's not confident that it could escalate further to an outright invasion, subjugation, annexation of Taiwan. That's why we focus so much in the book on the military dimension of being prepared to deter or win in a invasion scenario. There are different kinds of blockades. A maritime blockade, so where China commits its Coast Guard and warships and so forth. They're not easy to do, particularly if the merchant fleets are nationalized by the United States, Taiwan, Japan, and other countries, and continue to sail. Warships are pretty formidable from a distance, but up close, they're no match for a freighter. It's not a pretty look. We've had a couple of American warships get hit by them, and it wasn't pretty for us. It's hard to be in that many places at once, unless China is willing to sink ships, right? And using missiles from inland or using its navy. If it's using its navy, the same weapons that we would be acquiring to repel an invasion can be put to use to sink a blockade fleet. If China wants to use inland missiles just to sink ships from a far distance safely inland, it becomes harder for us to deter through a denial strategy. But we can still deter through punishment in that kind of a scenario by basically enlarging the blockade. You want to blockade Taiwan? Fine, let's just make it bigger. Let's blockade China in the process. And so we've got to be prepared to demonstrate that we have the ability to carry out something like that.
And of course, starting to sink ships means we're in a conflict, right? I mean, so I think there's this sort of conceptual problem where, in many ways, this effort to portray the blockade as this sort of bloodless victory, right? Now, if Beijing is sort of not prepared for the full invasion and not prepared for the full conflict, and all they're prepared to do is a blockade, and the United States and Japan and a couple of other countries choose to run that blockade and still supply things to Taiwan, I mean, you find yourself in a similar sort of 1948 Berlin airlift sort of scenario where the Soviets say that no one is allowed in, the United States challenges that, shots are not fired, and what happened in that scenario? The Soviet Union eventually gave up on that and disproved their own ability to be able to do that. So I think for Beijing, they have to remember that if they start that process, right, they actually have to be able to achieve the political object of what they're achieving, which is to replace the political leadership on Taiwan. And it's not clear to me that a blockade does that, right? Because it gives optionality to others. So again, preparing for the high-end fight, preparing for the full scale of it and deterring that is what makes the blockade much less attractive as an option.
I want to thank all of you for joining us here on this afternoon, and I also want us to just spend a moment to pause to remember the 35th anniversary of what happened in Beijing today, because there are very few places left in the world that are freely able to do that. So thank you.